I was in the Pentagon. It was a few years ago, but it was like what they call a tabletop war game. So about 15 experts sitting around doing scenarios, and I was sitting one seat away from a guy. He was a US Treasury financial, delegate to Asia, so kind of ambassador at large for the dollar, and his name was David Dollar. So it's kind of a nice twist. And I said, and this is back when the Iranian sanctions were a big deal. This is before Ukraine.
In an interview, Jim Rickards recalls a Pentagon war game scenario where he warned against over-reliance on weaponizing the US dollar. Despite assurances from a Treasury delegate, Rickards emphasized the need to continually earn trust. He doubted China's ability to become a global reserve currency due to infrastructure shortcomings. Rickards discussed the potential for a bottom-up retail bond market in BRICS countries challenging the dollar. He highlighted BRICS efforts to establish independent communication and payment systems and criticized the exclusion of certain countries from international payment systems. He suggested settling trade between BRICS countries in a common currency to reduce reliance on the dollar.
I said, this stuff works to an extent. It's not perfect, but it does work. And we did drive around to the bargaining table for the JCPOA in 2015. So I'm not saying it's completely ineffective. I said, but you guys are over. You're weaponizing the dollar, you're taking it too far, and you're going to get a backlash. How many times can you punch the punching bag before the punching bag gets up and walks out of the room? I told him this 8 years ago. David Dollar takes his hands. He takes both hands and slams them on the table, palm down. Boom. He goes, the US dollar has been the global reserve currency. It is the global reserve currency, and it will always be the global reserve. And I said, David, I feel like I'm in Whitehall in 1913 listening to John Bowles say, sterling is the global reserve currency, and it always will be, etc. But hubris is a good word. Plain English, taking it for granted. If you take your status for granted, then you can do all kinds of crazy stuff and not worry about it. But you can't take your status for granted. You have to earn it every day. We got the trust. We started with the trust earned, like I say, since 1791, but we blew it. And I've always said, and I told government officials this, I said, I don't really think our adversaries can destroy the dollar, but I think we can do it ourselves. And I would have said, and I have said in discussing, could China be the global reserve currency? Whatever. And I don't have to repeat it. But I went down all the elements and mechanics and hedging of a bond market big enough to be the global, to absorb global savings. And the Treasury has that. And I said, China's not even close. China's not going to be global reserve currency. I don't know. Maybe never. They don't have any of those things. They don't have primary dealers. They don't have auctions. They don't have a large bond market. They don't have a rule of law. But then in thinking about the BRICS currency, I had another one of these moments, like where the light bulb goes on. I said I was writing or something, doing some research on World War I. Basically, the history of government finance of war is what I was looking at. And I saw this Liberty bond poster, and Lady Liberty, Statue of Liberty with a torch. And she, instead of the tablet, she had a Liberty bond. And she was like, come on, America, we got to win the war. Buy Liberty bonds. And in my book, The New Great Depression, which came out in 2021, was half. The book was about the pandemic. Half was inflation deflation, but the other half was the pandemic. And one of the issues that came up because I said, well, it's kind of a new pandemic. Why not? I read about the old one, and I read 4 or 5 books on the Spanish flu of 1918. And one of the vignettes was, they didn't know until 1930 what caused the Spanish flu. They didn't know what a virus was, really, until the electron microscope. But they had a sense that it spread around. And so in Philadelphia in 1917, there was going to be this big parade to buy Liberty bonds. It was like a Freedom Win the War pet rally. And all these doctors at the University of Pennsylvania and elsewhere, don't do this. You're going to get 100,000 people on Broad Street, and they're all going to die of the Spanish flu. in effect. And they went ahead anyway. They did it because, for two reasons. One, that's how important it was. But two, there was more extreme censorship than there is today. I know that sounds like can't be true, but they were arresting people. You couldn't write a newspaper article about the Spanish flu because it was considered bad for morale in terms of the war. In fact, the reason it's called the Spanish flu is that Spain was not in World War I. They were not a belligerent. So their newspaper is like, hey, we got this now. And they were writing all about. And the rest of the world's like, hey, I read the Spanish newspaper. It said they got a flu. So they called it the Spanish flu, even though Spain had nothing to do with it. But they were the only country that was allowed to talk about it. But what that did, if you look at the history of, these are some old names that have just been around a while. E.F. Hutton, Dean Witter, Merrill Lynch. When were these firms founded? It was around 1910, 1912, 1914, and a little bit later, in some cases. But the Liberty Bond was the beginning of the retail investing market. Prior to World War I, U.S. wars were always financed by, like, big shots. Stephen Girard financed the war of, Nicholas Biddle financed the Revolutionary War. James Cook financed the Civil War. These, like, dealers who did it. But that all changed around World War I. So my point being, there's an example. Contrary to everything I just said about China building a top-down bond market, and I don't think they can do it. Here's an example of a bottom-up bond market where you basically got retail investors to buy into these bonds, and if you get enough of them, you're going to have a bond market because somebody will start making a market in it. And let's say you go to a typical Brazilian and you say, hey, you got two choices. You can buy a rice-denominated bond or you can buy a BRICS-denominated bond. That's not going to happen overnight by any means. But I think there is the potential for an indigenous bottom-up retail bond market in the BRICS currency, for the reasons I mentioned that over time, sooner than later, perhaps could give you something like a reserve currency status. So this thing is so well thought out. And even things that I would have objected to as recently as a couple of months ago say, well, it won't happen. Because I'm like, I've now modified no, actually, it could happen. But they built their own fiber optic submarine cable. They call it BRICS cable. And because the US is very good at tapping these things, I actually did a job once where I had to figure out all the global telecommunications in the world through cable. Long story. But there's something called CWE-ME, which is C is Southeast Asia, WE is Western Europe, and ME is Middle East. So CWE-ME is basically the cable system that connects Asia and London. And then there's a separate one that goes from London to United States.